I am William Crawford. I am 70 years old, and as I sit here looking back at the wreckage of my own family, I am still actively trying to process the absolute deepest betrayal a father could ever experience. My blood ran cold that night, but looking back, I realized the warning signs were always there. As the founder and original architect of a multi-million-dollar commercial heating and cooling empire, I spent my entire adult life meticulously building a legacy. I built it for one singular reason: to provide a fortress of financial security for my family. Last month, during an incredibly upscale dinner meant to honor the sacred memory of my late wife, my only son slammed his heavy crystal scotch glass down on the pristine white tablecloth. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly into my face, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. "Stop wasting my money," he hissed, the venom in his voice cutting through the soft jazz of the restaurant. I did not scream back. I did not cause a scene. I simply looked at him in absolute dead silence. The very next day, I meticulously emptied every single bank account he thought he controlled, dismantled his corporate authority, and completely disappeared. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to entitled family members who severely underestimated your worth and your intelligence. It was Columbus, Ohio, a bitterly cold Tuesday evening in late November. It was the exact kind of freezing, unforgiving wind that cuts straight through a heavy wool overcoat and settles deep into your bones. It was a cold that closely mirrored the profound, lingering grief I still carried with me every single day. We were sitting in a dimly lit, incredibly high-end steakhouse in the downtown business district. The ambiance was refined, thick with the scent of roasted garlic, seared ribeyes, and expensive aged mahogany. I was paying for the dinner. Of course, I always paid. This specific dinner was supposed to be a deeply sacred occasion for our family. We were gathered around that luxurious table to mark the third anniversary of the passing of my wife, Diane. Diane was my absolute rock. She was the woman who steadfastly stood by my side when I was just a 20-something kid, hauling heavy, rust-covered industrial air conditioning units out of the back of a battered Ford van. Back in those early days, I was busting my knuckles open on frozen metal every single day, working grueling 90-hour weeks just to keep the electricity on in our tiny, drafty apartment. She never complained. She was the steady heartbeat of our family, the quiet, unrelenting strength behind Crawford Commercial HVACs. Together, through decades of sheer grit, countless sleepless nights, and relentless physical sacrifice, we organically grew that tiny two-person operation into a massive, highly respected $40 million enterprise. Now, sitting at this opulent table under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, it was just me, my 35-year-old son Derek, and his wife Monica. Derek had officially taken over as the chief executive officer of the company exactly 1 year ago. I had willingly stepped back from the daily grind, taking the honorary title of chairman of the board. I genuinely believed it was finally time to let the next generation step up and confidently lead the empire I had constructed. Monica sat closely next to him. She was a former mid-level real estate agent who possessed an incredibly dangerous taste for flashy designer labels, imported sports cars, and highly exclusive country clubs. She was casually leaning back in her plush velvet chair, slowly sipping a $30 glass of imported Italian wine. She looked utterly bored, completely detached from the emotional significance of the evening. She wore a heavy diamond necklace that caught the ambient light. A piece of jewelry I knew for a fact was purchased with the corporate dividends I had generated. The atmosphere in the dining room was peaceful to everyone else. Crystal glasses clinked in quiet toasts, and impeccably dressed waiters moved silently across the carpeted floor. But our specific table felt suffocatingly heavy. There was a palpable, toxic tension hanging thickly in the air, a tension I had been desperately trying to ignore for months. Derek had been acting incredibly strange lately. He was distant, evasive, and increasingly arrogant. I had continuously made excuses for his poor behavior. I repeatedly told myself he was simply struggling to adjust to the immense pressure of running a massive corporation with over 300 employees. I was completely wrong. When the waiter silently cleared our main courses and poured the very last drops of the expensive wine, I felt it was the appropriate moment to share a deeply personal decision I had made. It was a charitable decision that had been bringing me a rare, comforting sense of peace during an incredibly difficult week of mourning. I reached into the breast pocket, my tailored charcoal suit jacket, and pulled out my personal leather-bound checkbook. I set it gently on the crisp white tablecloth, right next to the flickering candlelight. I looked directly at Derek, searching desperately for even a fleeting trace of his mother's warmth in his eyes. "I have been thinking a lot about your mother this week," I said, keeping my voice steady, calm, and respectfully low. "You know exactly how much she loved the St. Jude Community Church. That old stone building has been struggling with a collapsing slate roof for over 5 years. Diane always talked about fixing it for them when we finally had the time. So, to properly honor her memory tonight, I am going to write a check for $50,000 from my personal savings account. It will completely cover the restoration of the church roof. They are going to put a small brass plaque by the entrance with her name on it." I naively expected a simple nod of approval. I expected perhaps a shared, quiet moment of grief. Instead, the reaction I received was instantaneous, visceral, and violently explosive. Derek snatched his heavy crystal Scotch glass from the table and slammed it down with such brute, uncontrolled force that the thick stem completely shattered in his grip. The sharp, terrifying crack of breaking glass echoed instantly through the elegant dining room, violently cutting through the soft jazz music. Several wealthy patrons at nearby tables abruptly stopped their conversations, turning their heads in absolute shock. Jagged shards of crystal, sharp ice cubes, and amber liquid spilled wildly across the white linen, soaking into the pristine fabric like a dark, ugly stain. Derek aggressively leaned across the table, completely invading my personal space. His face flushed a dark, furious red, the thick veins in his neck bulging aggressively against his expensive silk tie. He thrust his index finger directly into my face. His eyes were wide, manic, and completely unhinged. "Stop wasting my money," he hissed the horrible words with a venomous, guttural intensity that carried effortlessly across the silent room. "What the hell are you doing, writing 50 grand checks to a useless, crumbling church? Are you completely losing your mind, old man?" Underneath the table, I heard a sharp, painful thud. Monica had violently kicked his shin. Her eyes darted nervously around the upscale room, visibly panicking at the unwanted attention of the wealthy onlookers. Derek flinched slightly from the kick, but his furious, hateful glare remained locked entirely on me. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his custom-tailored Italian suit jacket. A jacket that was completely paid for by the massive corporate empire I had built from absolute scratch. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands in defense. I did not yell back at him. I just froze completely solid, staring deeply into the eyes of the absolute stranger sitting across from me. The words echoed in my mind with a deafening, paralyzing roar. My money. He had just aggressively called my personal savings, the money I had bled and sweat for over 4 grueling decades, his money. I had spent 28 years breathing in toxic fiberglass insulation. I had frozen my hands to the bone on commercial rooftops in the dead of the brutal Ohio winters. I had gladly sacrificed my own youth, my physical health, and my free time, so he would never have to know the bitter, humiliating taste of poverty. I stepped back from the daily grind for just 1 single year. And in that unbelievably short amount of time, his natural entitlement had mutated into something terrifyingly monstrous. He truly believed he owned my personal wealth. He truly believed he owned me. I slowly reached out, picked up my leather checkbook, and slid it calmly back into my breast pocket. I stood up slowly from the table, ensuring my posture was perfectly straight. I reached into my thick leather wallet, pulled out 2 crisp $100 bills, and dropped them directly onto the soaked, glass-covered tablecloth to generously cover the ruined meal. I turned my back on my son and his gold-digger wife. I walked out of the restaurant, pushing through the heavy wooden doors and stepping out into the freezing Columbus night. The chilling wind hit my face, but I barely felt the cold. My mind was completely clear. My heart, though broken into 1,000 pieces, was now beating with a cold, terrifying new purpose. I knew right then, without a single shadow of a doubt, that the war for my life and my legacy had already started. I woke up before dawn the very next morning. The house was painfully quiet. It was a massive, sprawling brick estate located in the highly affluent neighborhood of Upper Arlington. Diane and I had purchased the property 20 years ago. Without her, the massive halls just felt like an empty, echoing museum. I brewed a strong pot of black coffee and sat at the expansive granite kitchen island, quietly watching the heavy frost cling to the bare branches of the oak trees in the sprawling backyard. My mind was endlessly replaying the horrific events of the previous night. By 8 o'clock, the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed loudly through the silent hallway. I set my ceramic mug down slowly, walked across the expansive marble foyer, and carefully opened the heavy front door. Derek and Monica were standing on my front porch. The freezing wind was violently whipping Monica's perfectly styled blonde hair across her face. Derek was awkwardly holding a massive, shrink-wrapped premium fruit basket, complete with an oversized, ridiculous gold ribbon. He looked absolutely awful. His eyes were heavily bloodshot and his skin had the pale, clammy sheen of a man who had spent the entire night nursing a severe Scotch hangover. Monica wore a bright, incredibly forced smile that did not quite reach her cold eyes. "Dad," Derek said, his voice raspy and remarkably smaller than the booming, arrogant roar he had used at the steakhouse just 12 hours prior. "Can we come in, please? We really need to talk to you." I stepped back silently, pulling the heavy door wide to let the freezing winter air and my uninvited guests inside. They stepped quickly into the warm foyer. Derek practically shoved the heavy, ridiculous fruit basket into my hands. I carried it silently into the kitchen and set it down on the granite counter without bothering to remove the gold ribbon. I gestured toward the formal living room. I took my usual heavy leather armchair by the stone fireplace. Derek and Monica sat tightly together on the very edge of the long sofa, looking exactly like two guilty teenagers called into the principal's office. The silence in the room stretched out, thick and incredibly suffocating. I simply crossed my hands in my lap, kept my face entirely neutral, and waited for them to speak. Derek cracked first. "Dad, I am so incredibly sorry about last night," he began, his voice thickly laced with manufactured, heavy remorse. "My behavior at the restaurant was completely unacceptable. It is just the stress, Dad. The pressure of running Crawford Commercial HVAC is literally eating me alive. Last night, I had way too much scotch on an empty stomach. When you pulled out that checkbook to give away $50,000, I just panicked." I snapped. I felt like the weight of the entire company was crushing my chest, and I took it out on you. "Please, you have to believe me." Before I could even formulate a cold response to his hollow apology, Monica smoothly leaned forward and placed a perfectly manicured, comforting hand over Derek's knee. She looked directly at me with an expression of profound, sickeningly sweet concern. "It is the absolute truth, William," she said softly. Her voice was pure velvet, dripping with calculated empathy. "Derek has been working himself to the bone to make you proud. But honestly, William, we have both been terribly worried about you lately. You have been living completely alone in this massive house for 3 years now. Grief does very strange things to the mind." My heart slowed to a steady, freezing rhythm. I looked at her, worried about me. I asked, my tone dangerously flat. "Yes," Monica continued without missing a single beat. "You are so incredibly generous, William. We have been reading these awful, terrifying reports in the news about elder fraud. When you pulled out your checkbook last night to hand over 50 grand to that old church, Derek just panicked because he desperately wants to protect you. He meant to say our family money, not his money." She smiled softly, tilting her head with a look of practiced, maternal concern. "That is exactly why we quietly took the necessary initiative to set up a family protection trust last week. Just to legally shield your personal assets from potential scammers. It is just a very standard and necessary safety measure for older, high-net-worth individuals like yourself." I nodded slowly, forcing the hard lines of my face to soften slightly, pretending to graciously accept their seemingly genuine apology. But deep inside my chest, my 40 years of cutthroat corporate business instincts were screaming a deafening, blaring warning. The terrifying phrase "family protection trust" immediately sounded suspiciously like a completely permanent and unbreakable legal cage. After they finally left my house, taking their hollow apologies and leaving the stupid fruit basket behind, I needed to completely clear my head. I walked out to the detached four-car garage and pulled the heavy canvas cover off my vintage 1978 Ford pickup truck. It was the very first vehicle I ever bought brand new, paying with pure cash from the HVAC business profits. It was forest green, meticulously maintained, and completely devoid of modern touchscreens. I turned the ignition key, and the heavy engine roared aggressively to life. I drove toward the grittier industrial side of town, heading to a small independent mechanic shop owned by an old friend named Arthur. I had scheduled a simple winter tune-up a few weeks prior. When the mechanical work was finally completely finished, Arthur walked behind the scratched wooden counter to ring me up. The total came out to exactly $415. I reached into my thick leather wallet and pulled out my heavy black card. This was a highly exclusive private wealth management card, an account with absolutely no preset spending limit, tied directly to a massive reservoir of liquid cash I had painstakingly accumulated over decades of relentless work. I handed the heavy metal card to Arthur. He took it and swiped it through his dusty electronic payment terminal. A few seconds later, the terminal let out a sharp, harsh, negative beep. Arthur frowned, looking down at the small digital screen. He wiped the magnetic strip of my card on his apron and swiped it a second time. The machine beeped again. Arthur looked up at me, an apologetic and deeply embarrassed expression washing over his weathered face. "William, I am really sorry," he said, keeping his voice incredibly low. "The machine is saying the card is declined." I stared at him, completely uncomprehending. Declined. I had millions of dollars sitting in that specific account. It was an account I used strictly for personal expenses. I had never, not once in my entire adult life, had a credit card declined. I forced a calm, reassuring smile. "It must be a security flag," I told Arthur smoothly, pulling my smartphone from my coat pocket. "Give me just one moment, Arthur. I will call my private wealth manager directly and have them clear it up immediately." I stepped outside the garage, pulling my heavy wool coat tight against the bitter wind. I dialed the direct private extension for my personal banking manager, Richard. Finally, there was a sharp click. Richard answered the line, but his voice did not project the usual confident, professional warmth. He sounded hesitant, breathless, and incredibly terrified. "Richard," I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "I am standing at a mechanic shop in the freezing cold, and my primary card was just declined for a $400 charge. I need you to lift whatever security hold is currently blocking my funds right this second." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute and absolutely terrifying. "William, I am so sorry," he finally whispered, his voice trembling with genuine fear. "I cannot lift the hold. I no longer have the legal authorization to allow you access to those funds." "What are you talking about, Richard?" I demanded. "It is my account. It is my money, William. Please listen to me very carefully," Richard pleaded, his voice dropping to a frantic, hushed whisper. "First thing this morning, your son, Derek, and a team of 3 corporate attorneys walked directly into my office. They presented a binding court order signed by a local judge. Your accounts have not been flagged for fraud. Your accounts have been entirely frozen under a co-conservatorship order. Derek has been granted temporary emergency control over all your personal finances." My blood ran absolutely cold. The plausible lie from the morning completely shattered into a million jagged pieces right before my eyes. The Family Protection Trust was not designed to playfully shield my money from outside scammers. It was a vicious, calculated weapon designed to meticulously strip me of my independence. They had legally locked me out of my own life. I hung up the phone and stood completely frozen in the biting winter wind. The loose gravel under my work boots felt incredibly unsteady. A conservatorship. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of that specific legal maneuver echoed loudly through my mind. Derek had not just aggressively frozen my personal checking accounts. He had executed a calculated, precise, legal strike to permanently strip me of my fundamental human autonomy. According to the state of Ohio, I was suddenly a legally incapacitated old man, entirely dependent on the supposedly benevolent protection of a son who had meticulously orchestrated my financial imprisonment. I climbed back into the freezing cab of my 1978 Ford pickup truck. I slammed the heavy metal door shut, gripped the freezing steering wheel, and jammed the manual transmission forcefully into gear. I had to physically see the extent of the damage. I had to know exactly how far this toxic infection had spread into the corporate empire I had built from nothing. I drove straight toward the downtown business district. My ultimate destination was the massive glass and steel headquarters of Crawford Commercial HVAC. I parked my vintage truck in the adjacent concrete parking garage, intentionally avoiding my reserved prime parking spot near the front entrance. I desperately wanted to enter quietly, without drawing any unwanted attention to my sudden arrival. I walked smoothly through the sliding glass doors and stepped into the expansive marble-floored lobby. Nobody paid any special attention to the 70-year-old man, walking briskly toward the back corridor. I bypassed the main reception desk and headed directly for the private executive elevator bank. This was a highly secure access point designed exclusively for top-tier management. I reached into my coat pocket and retrieved my heavy gold-trimmed founder badge. It was a unique master key card that granted me unrestricted, total access to every single floor. I confidently held the badge up to the sleek black security scanner. Instead of a green light, the scanner let out a harsh, abrupt beep. A bright, glaring red light aggressively illuminated the digital panel. The display read, "Accessed." In it, I wiped the badge on my coat and swiped it a second time. The machine beeped again, flashing that identical, mocking red warning. Access. Denny Derrick had not just locked me out of my personal bank accounts. He had systematically and deliberately purged my digital identity from the corporate security mainframe. I was officially a ghost inside the very walls I had personally paid to construct. My jaw tightened. I took a step back and leaned casually against the cold marble wall. After about 10 minutes, I spotted a young, incredibly nervous-looking intern, balancing a towering stack of cardboard document boxes and 4 oversized cups of scalding coffee. As the intern finally managed to trigger the green light on the standard elevator bank, I stepped directly behind him, slipping smoothly through the sliding glass security turnstile, right before the heavy doors snapped shut. "Do not worry about it, son," I said smoothly, reaching out to gently steady the top box of documents. "I accidentally left my badge up on the top floor. Just hit the button for the executive suite for me. Would you?" The elevator ascended smoothly, carrying me rapidly upward into the very heart of the occupied territory. I stepped off the elevator and walked silently down the pristine carpeted hallway of the executive floor. I bypassed the main boardroom and headed straight toward the expansive corner suite that used to comfortably belong to my chief financial officer. As I approached the heavy glass door, I stopped dead in my tracks. I peered carefully through the slightly parted window blinds. Monica, my son's entitled gold digger wife, was sitting comfortably behind the massive mahogany desk. She held absolutely no official title in my company. Yet she was casually leaning back in the expensive leather chair, sipping sparkling water, as if she owned the entire building. Spread carelessly across the mahogany desk were several thick stacks of legal documents. I recognized the distinctive corporate watermarks immediately. She was holding a heavy gold pen, casually signing commercial real estate transfer deeds printed directly on my company's official letterhead. She was actively liquidating Crawford commercial property assets. They were quietly and ruthlessly dismantling my entire corporate infrastructure piece by piece, eagerly converting brick and steel into liquid cash without any oversight or legal board approval. My chest burned with a furious explosive heat, but my mind remained perfectly cold. I absolutely did not push the heavy glass door open. Confrontation without absolute leverage is just useless noise. I memorized the scene, turned around, and walked silently back down the carpeted hallway. I got back into my heavy vintage Ford and merged onto the interstate. I needed someone whose unwavering loyalty belonged exclusively to me. I needed a man who intimately understood the dirty, brutal reality of corporate warfare and possessed the iron stomach to fight back. I drove 20 miles outside the city limits to a rusted, neon-lit diner sitting completely alone on a desolate stretch of highway. Sitting in the back corner booth, casually nursing a black coffee, was Rick Dalton. Rick was my former attack dog attorney. He had aggressively defended my company against frivolous lawsuits and hostile takeover attempts for over 30 years. He possessed a brilliant legal mind and an absolute absence of moral hesitation when properly protecting his clients. I slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from him. I laid out the entire timeline with surgical precision. I told him about the horrific anniversary dinner, the shattered crystal glass, and the terrifying rage in Derek's eyes when he screamed about his money. I detailed the theatrical apology the next morning, the ridiculous fruit basket, and Monica's smooth lie about setting up a family protection trust to shield me from elder fraud. Finally, I told him about the flashing red light at the executive elevator and watching Monica signing commercial real estate transfer deeds on my company letterhead. Rick set his ceramic coffee mug down heavily on the sticky table. He did not look shocked. He looked deeply, intensely analytical. A conservatorship, Rick murmured, shaking his head slowly in genuine disbelief. That is the absolute nuclear option, William. They did not just temporarily lock your checking accounts. They successfully convinced a presiding judge that you are severely mentally incapacitated. They essentially legally declared that you are no longer a functioning adult capable of managing your own daily affairs. He rubbed his jaw. It takes extensive, rigorous documentation to pull a stunt like that off. They would absolutely need a licensed medical professional to sign a sworn affidavit confirming your severe cognitive decline. They have been meticulously planning this corporate and personal coup for many months. I need to know exactly how deep this treacherous knife goes, I said, keeping my voice incredibly steady. I need to know exactly what they have stolen, and I need to know it right this second. Rick did not hesitate for a single moment. He reached into his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a battered, heavily modified laptop. He quickly connected to a secure encrypted mobile hotspot and began typing furiously. Rick was entirely bypassing the standard public search engines, aggressively digging directly into the deeply buried county public records and restricted state judicial databases. His jaw tightened remarkably. The Family Protection Trust is a real entity, Rick said, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon rapidly scrolling across his monitor. But it is absolutely not a protective shield, William. It is a massive financial vacuum. They deliberately structured it as an ironclad, irrevocable trust, specifically naming Derek as the primary controlling trustee and Monica as the secondary. They have already aggressively funneled the vast majority of your liquid personal assets into it. Rick fell completely silent again, his fingers flying rapidly across the keys as he drastically shifted his complex search parameters. He carefully typed in the specific address of my massive, sprawling brick estate located in Upper Arlington. The beautiful home where Diane and I had joyfully raised our entire family. Finally, the page successfully populated with a dense, complicated block of official government text. Rick abruptly stopped typing. He took a slow, incredibly heavy breath and looked directly up at me. His expression was significantly grimmer than I had ever seen it. "William," he said quietly, his voice carrying a dark weight that made my stomach instantly drop. "I need you to brace yourself." Rick turned the laptop completely around and slid it across the sticky table so it faced me directly. I looked straight down at the glowing screen. There, in stark black and white digital text, was the official deed to my Upper Arlington estate. But my name was completely gone. In its place, listed as the absolute sole owners of the property, were Derek and Monica Crawford. The date of the fraudulent transfer was stamped clearly at the bottom. It had been executed 3 weeks ago. My signature had been entirely, flawlessly forged. My blood ran completely cold. I did not just lose my company or my bank accounts. I had literally lost my only physical sanctuary. If I went back to that house right now and angrily confronted them, they could legally evict me on the very spot. They could call the local police and have me immediately arrested for trespassing in what used to be my own home. I walked out of that greasy diner with Rick Dalton's grim warning ringing loudly in my ears. The freezing night air hit my face, but I felt absolutely nothing. My own son had forged my signature. He had stolen the very house where his mother had rocked him to sleep. I climbed into the cab of my vintage pickup truck and drove to a modest, run-down motel on the edge of the county line, paying in untraceable cash. I sat on the lumpy mattress and stared blankly at the peeling wallpaper. Panic is the ultimate enemy of logic. I had to dismantle Derek's illusion of absolute control. To do that, I needed the undeniable proof of his corporate theft. Derek always looked at me like I was an obsolete dinosaur. He thought his newly installed corporate firewalls and digital tokens had permanently locked me out of the accounting systems. But Derek was arrogant, and arrogance breeds catastrophic oversights. He had completely forgotten the foundational history of the building. 20 years ago, I personally oversaw the installation of the original internal server architecture. When we transitioned to newer systems, I mandated that the core mainframe remain actively tethered to the network as a fail-safe redundancy. I had my engineers install a hardwired master override protocol. It was an off-the-grid access terminal, bypassing every external firewall. It was strictly tied to my physical biometrics. I did not need a digital password, I just needed my own body. I reached out to Mike Navarro, a highly resourceful private investigator I had kept on retainer for years. I met Navarro in the deserted parking lot of a grocery store at midnight. I handed him an envelope of cash and told him I needed a military-grade encrypted hard drive with the highest possible transfer speed. Navarro nodded, handed over a heavy black metal casing, and drove away without asking a single question. I sat in my truck watching the dashboard clock slowly tick forward. I needed the building to be completely abandoned. I waited until the digital numbers glowing on my dashboard clicked to exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. Then I put the truck in gear and drove back toward the glass and steel fortress I had built. The real investigation was about to begin. I parked 2 blocks away from the main campus in a dark, neglected alleyway. I walked briskly toward the rear loading docks of the Crawford headquarters. Derek had recently spent hundreds of thousands of dollars aggressively upgrading the perimeter security. But he did not know about the old maintenance tunnel. I slipped quietly behind the massive steel bin and found the old iron grate. I pulled a heavy crowbar from my coat, jammed it forcefully under the iron edge, and pulled with all the strength my 70-year-old arms could muster. The grate groaned loudly and lifted. I slid down into the damp, freezing darkness of the tunnel. I navigated the narrow passage using a small tactical flashlight, eventually reaching the heavy, reinforced steel door at the very end. I reached deep into my pocket, pulled out a heavy brass skeleton key I had carried on my ring for 2 decades, and slid it smoothly into the mechanical lock. I pulled the heavy door open and stepped silently into the sub-basement of the Crawford headquarters. I walked confidently through the dimly lit corridors, heading straight for the central server room. It was a standalone concrete bunker secured tightly behind a thick security door. I approached the access panel. It was an older model, completely untouched by Derek's expensive technological renovations. I placed my right hand flat onto the glass surface of the scanner. A thin line of red light slowly swept across my palm. Next, a small digital lens smoothly extended from the wall panel. I leaned forward, perfectly aligning my right eye with the glowing green targeting reticle. The scanner pulsed, casting a bright beam of light directly into my pupil. For 3 agonizingly long seconds, the terminal remained entirely silent. Then, the heavy steel door emitted a loud, incredibly satisfying electronic clack. A thick green light illuminated the access panel. I grabbed the cold metal handle and pulled the door open. I stepped directly into the freezing server room. I walked purposefully to the primary console, sitting at the center of the room. I flipped the protective cover off the master override port, unzipped my coat, pulled out the military-grade encrypted hard drive Navarro had provided, and plugged the thick black cable directly into the mainframe terminal. A stark command prompt instantly booted on the dusty monitor. The system had successfully recognized my biometric authority. I was fully in. I rapidly typed in a sequence of legacy command codes, effortlessly bypassing Derek's modern accounting software and diving straight into the raw, unfiltered root directories. I hit the execution key. The blue progress bar flashed onto the screen. I stood completely alone in the freezing basement, watching the digital numbers rapidly climb as I systematically began downloading the last 12 months of Derek's secret shadow accounting. To pass the agonizing time, I opened a secondary window on the terminal and manually accessed the raw data packets, filtering through the network bridge. I opened the master ledger for the 3rd quarter. At a casual, superficial glance, everything looked perfectly normal. But I did not build a $40 million empire by merely looking at the surface. I isolated the outgoing vendor payments and meticulously filtered them by origination date, specifically targeting the exact month Derek officially assumed the role of Chief Executive Officer. The true, horrifying story emerged almost immediately. Hidden deeply beneath the massive, legitimate purchases of industrial copper piping, there was a steady, rhythmic bleed. I found a recurring, weekly outgoing wire transfer consistently routed to an entity listed as Apex Logistics Solutions. They were consistently billed at exactly $45,000 a week. I cross-referenced our approved vendor database. Apex Logistics Solutions did not exist in our system before last November. I ran a secondary search. Apex Logistics Solutions was a limited liability company registered to a generic post office box in Delaware. It was a classic textbook shell company. My own son was slowly bleeding Crawford Commercial HVAC entirely dry. I kept digging. Apex was just the beginning. I quickly uncovered 5 more ghost entities: Horizon Strategic Ventures, Summit Global Purchasing, Pinnacle Consulting Partners. Over the last 12 months, Derek had effortlessly embezzled nearly $4 million directly from the primary operational accounts. The sheer scale of the theft was staggering. But as I intensely scrutinized the balance sheets, a terrifying inconsistency caught my eye. The internal cash flow indicators were violently flashing severe red warnings. The company was actively drowning in a severe liquidity crisis. I dug deeper into the central collateral registries, holding my breath as the highly encrypted files slowly decrypted onto the screen. What I found next made the physical embezzlement look like a minor administrative error. Derek was actively utilizing the entire corporate entity as collateral. I opened a deeply buried directory labeled Offshore Liabilities. My son had taken the physical assets of Crawford Commercial HVAC, the heavy machinery, the sprawling distribution warehouses, the massive fleet of 300 service trucks, and he had legally pledged them against massive, highly leveraged offshore margin accounts. He was borrowing tens of millions of dollars from unregulated international financial institutions, aggressively funneling the borrowed capital into high-risk, incredibly volatile foreign exchange markets and aggressive short-term investment strategies. If those offshore margin calls suddenly failed, the international lenders would legally seize every single asset tied to the Crawford name. Derek had effectively strapped a massive financial bomb to the very core of the company, and the timer was ticking down rapidly. My chest tightened with a suffocating, blinding rage. He had looked me straight in the eye at that high-end steakhouse, violently slammed his crystal glass on the table, and screamed about me wasting his money. He desperately needed the Family Protection Trust to absorb my personal wealth because he had completely decimated the corporate wealth. The progress bar on the monitor finally hit 100%. A green notification box popped onto the screen, confirming the massive data transfer was completely successful. I ejected the military-grade hard drive from the port and slipped it deep into the inside pocket of my thick winter wool coat. I closed the raw command terminal, meticulously wiping my digital footprint from the master override registry. I finally possessed the raw financial data, but the accounting ledgers completely failed to reveal their tactical strategy against me. Derek and Monica had successfully orchestrated a fraudulent medical conservatorship to strip away my human rights and steal my home. I desperately needed to know exactly when they intended to execute their final, devastating blow against me. I slipped the heavy encrypted hard drive deeper into my thick wool coat and turned my back on the glowing server banks. I began the arduous climb up the central concrete stairwell to the top floor of the corporate headquarters. I reached the heavy fire doors of the executive level and moved silently down the hallway. I stopped firmly at the massive double doors of Derek's corner office. The door was locked with a modern biometric deadbolt. I reached into my pocket and retrieved a small, specialized magnetic bypass key provided by Navarro. I slid the thin strip of magnetized metal directly into the microscopic gap between the digital strike plate and the doorframe. I wiggled it gently until I heard the faint, satisfying click of the mechanical tumbler releasing. I stepped into the vast executive suite. I walked deliberately across the room and stood directly behind his marble desk. I reached into the inner lining of my coat and pulled out a small sealed plastic envelope. Inside was a piece of military-grade surveillance equipment. It was a micro-audio transmitter barely the size of a standard coin cell battery, equipped with an omnidirectional condenser microphone. I looked down at the right corner of the marble desk. Resting there was a heavy, custom-crafted brass reading lamp. I had commissioned that specific lamp from a local artisan as a deeply sentimental gift for Derek on the day I officially promoted him to Chief Executive Officer. Now, that deeply sentimental gift was going to become the very instrument of his absolute downfall. I carefully laid the heavy brass lamp on its side, removed the protective felt pad from the bottom, and began unscrewing the heavy base plate. I peeled back a 1/4 inch of the black rubber insulation, exposing the live copper wires. I meticulously wrapped the fragile transmitter, leads directly around the exposed copper wires of the desk lamp, taping them tightly with electrical tape. As long as the lamp remained plugged into the wall outlet, the surveillance bug would aggressively draw a continuous, undetectable trickle of electricity. I carefully replaced the heavy base plate, stood the lamp upright, and meticulously wiped down the brass casing and the marble surface, perfectly erasing any trace of my physical presence. I retreated down the stairs, crawled back through the freezing maintenance tunnel, and finally made it to the dark alleyway. I climbed into the freezing cab of my truck and locked the heavy metal doors. I pulled out the small black receiver unit, plugged the molded earpiece into the jack, and secured it firmly in my right ear. I flipped the power switch. A soft, crystal-clear hiss of static filled my ear. I could hear the faint, distant hum of the building's massive heating system filtering through the microphone. The audio feed was absolutely flawless. I leaned back against the worn leather seat of my truck, staring fiercely through the frost-covered windshield at the towering glass headquarters across the street. The massive trap was officially set. Now I just had to sit in the freezing darkness and wait for them to speak. For 3 agonizing days, I lived entirely inside the freezing cab of my vintage Ford pickup truck. I parked discreetly in the back corner of a busy coffee shop parking lot, completely blending in with the daily flow of morning commuters and delivery vans. The weather had turned brutally unforgiving. A relentless, freezing sleet actively battered the windshield, layering the glass in a thick, suffocating sheet of gray ice. My entire existence had been violently reduced to the continuous, soft hiss of static playing through the molded plastic earpiece, secured firmly in my right ear. I was a silent phantom aggressively haunting the perimeter of my own stolen empire. Listening to my own son casually play the role of the visionary chief executive officer made my stomach churn with a sickening blend of profound sorrow and escalating rage. But I did not let my focus waver for a single second. Patience is the ultimate weapon of an experienced hunter. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the freezing sleet finally transitioned into a heavy, blinding snowstorm. Derek was casually wrapping up a phone call with a regional logistics manager. When the call finally disconnected, a brief, heavy silence settled over the executive corner office. Then, I heard the unmistakable sound of the heavy wooden door swinging open. The biometric deadbolt clicked loudly. The sharp, rapid clicking of high heels echoed aggressively across the imported marble floor. Monica had arrived. Did the medical certificate completely clear through the county clerk yet? Monica demanded. Her voice was incredibly sharp, laced with a toxic, impatient anxiety. I swear to God, if there is a single delay in the judicial processing, I am going to completely lose my mind. That hack psychiatrist charged us $50,000 in untraceable cash just to backdate the evaluation paperwork. He guaranteed the expedited filing. I sat frozen in the cab of my truck. The bitter cold seeping through the floorboards suddenly paled in comparison to the absolute ice aggressively flooding my veins. $50,000 in cash, a hack psychiatrist, backdated evaluation paperwork. They had successfully orchestrated a highly illegal, profoundly malicious secret medical conspiracy. They had literally purchased a fraudulent medical diagnosis from a corrupt physician to scientifically validate their fabricated claims of my mental incompetence. Derek let out a low, incredibly dark chuckle. Relax, Derek replied, his voice dripping with arrogant, overwhelming satisfaction. You worry entirely too much. The cash payment completely secured his total cooperation. He fabricated a comprehensive 3-year medical history detailing a rapid, aggressive cognitive decline. He falsified the clinical observation records, the mandatory memory test results, and the sworn neurological affidavit. I spoke directly with our lead litigation attorney 20 minutes ago. It is done. The presiding probate judge officially signed off on the Stage 2 Alzheimer's disease diagnosis this morning. The permanent conservatorship is officially ours. The words hit me like a devastating physical blow to the chest. Stage 2 Alzheimer's disease. By purposefully purchasing that highly specific, permanent fake diagnosis, they had effectively, legally erased my entire mind. The final logistical phase is completely mapped out and firmly secured, Derek stated smoothly. The ambulance is officially scheduled for next Friday, at 9 in the morning. They will pick the old man up and take him directly to the lockdown dementia ward at Shady Pines. Through the earpiece, I heard Monica let out a sharp, genuine laugh. Shady Pines, Monica repeated, her voice dripping with profound amusement. That is absolutely brilliant, Derek. Once he is securely locked in the memory ward, nobody will believe a single word he says. If he desperately tries to report us for corporate embezzlement, the underpaid nursing staff will simply sedate him and document it as a severe paranoid delusion. He will be entirely neutralized. The physical extraction on Friday morning is merely the final operational cleanup, Derek continued. We wire the $12 million in cash to the hidden Cayman accounts on Thursday night and formally file for corporate bankruptcy on Monday. The entire commercial entity will instantly collapse under the massive weight of the highly leveraged offshore margin debt. We will publicly claim that the senile old man severely mismanaged the corporate supply chain during his rapid cognitive decline. I squeezed my eyes tightly shut against the blinding panic. The sheer breathtaking cruelty of their meticulous strategy was almost entirely impossible to fully comprehend. On Thursday night, they would ruthlessly wire $12 million to the untraceable Cayman Islands. On Friday morning, the heavily guarded private ambulance would arrive directly at my front door to permanently lock me away. On Monday morning, they would completely obliterate the $40 million corporate empire. But they had confidently made one absolutely catastrophic, undeniably fatal miscalculation. They did not know I had clearly recorded every single damning syllable of their horrific conspiracy. I turned the ignition key, and the heavy engine roared aggressively to life. The long time for my silent observation was officially over. I drove straight through the howling storm toward the affluent suburbs of Dublin, heading directly for Rick Dalton's private residence. It was 4 in the morning when I pulled into his winding tree-lined driveway. I aggressively pounded my frozen fist against the wood until Rick answered the door. He ushered me into his warm, dimly lit home office. I set the military-grade encrypted hard drive firmly on his mahogany desk. Then I placed the black audio receiver directly next to the drive and hit the playback button. Rick stood perfectly still, listening as the crystal-clear recording filled the quiet room. He listened to Monica, complaining about paying a corrupt psychiatrist a $50,000 cash bribe. He listened to Derek proudly confirming the fake Stage 2 Alzheimer's disease diagnosis. He listened as my own son calmly detailed his horrific plan to have me violently dragged out of my home on Friday morning by an ambulance crew. When the audio recording finally clicked off, Rick slowly walked over to his desk, plugged the encrypted hard drive securely into his secure forensic computer, and launched a series of complex data decryption tools. For nearly an hour, he was meticulously tracing the origin points of the massive offshore margin accounts Derek had recklessly established. Suddenly, Rick stopped typing. "William," Rick said, his voice entirely devoid of its usual aggressive confidence. "Derek has not merely been siphoning your operating capital to fund a lavish lifestyle. He has been systematically liquidating your entire corporate infrastructure to actively cover catastrophic, incredibly reckless investment losses." Rick turned the large monitor toward me, pointing to a highly unregulated, black market cryptocurrency exchange based out of Eastern Europe. Derek had been aggressively day trading volatile digital assets using extreme, illegal institutional leverage. Rick explained grimly. He lost a staggering $20 million over the past 8 months. The massive margin calls are coming due. He has completely exhausted the corporate cash reserves. The $12 million they are planning to wire to the Cayman Islands on Thursday night is not a strategic corporate maneuver. It is the absolute last remaining scrap of liquid cash your company possesses. It is their untraceable getaway fund. Rick placed his hands firmly on the heavy mahogany desk. William, you need to firmly understand the absolute gravity of the federal landscape right now. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission are actively investigating these specific offshore crypto platforms for massive institutional money laundering and severe wire fraud. When the federal agents finally raid the corporate headquarters on Monday, Derek and Monica will already be long gone. Your forged signature is printed aggressively on every single illegal offshore transfer document. You will be the sole corporate owner on paper, securely locked inside an underfunded state asylum. They are leaving you behind to purposefully take the entire absolute fall for massive federal wire fraud. We need to contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately, Rick insisted. I shook my head, feeling a cold absolute focus entirely overriding the panic. We cannot go to the federal authorities yet, Rick. If the federal government rapidly intervenes and freezes the corporate assets now, that remaining $12 million will be entirely trapped in a judicial limbo for the next decade. The company will instantly default on payroll. My employees will unfairly lose their livelihoods by Friday afternoon. I must secure that money before the authorities even know it exists. William Derrick holds the legal authority of the chief executive officer, Rick said with deep skepticism. You do not possess the legal authority to move a penny. I leaned forward, resting my forearms firmly on the mahogany. Derrick confidently believes corporate power is derived entirely from his current executive title. He conveniently forgot who authored the original corporate bylaws 28 years ago. I need you to pull up the original corporate charter we drafted when Crawford Commercial first incorporated. Navigate directly to Section 7, Paragraph 4. Rick turned back to his computer, opened the original charter, and scrolled rapidly down the screen. Suddenly, a sharp gasp quickly escaped his lips. The poison pill, Rick whispered, his voice trembling with profound realization. I completely forgot we actively embedded this mechanism into the foundational framework. When I established this company, I had instructed Rick to weave an obscure clause into the foundational DNA of the corporation. It stated that if the sitting chief executive officer was actively defrauding the corporate entity, the founder retained the unilateral legal right to immediately revoke all executive powers and seize total control of all liquid assets without requiring a board vote. It was a legal guillotine designed to perfectly sever a rogue executive's head. But William, Rick stammered frantically, this clause requires undeniable proof of corporate fraud. I tapped my index finger firmly against the encrypted hard drive. I have the entire shadow ledger detailing $4 million in corporate embezzlement. I have the illegal offshore margin account documentation. I have a crystal-clear audio recording of him explicitly admitting to purchasing a fraudulent medical diagnosis to forcefully strip away my human rights. I need you to strictly format the legal execution of the poison pill protocol. For 48 hours, Rick and I worked in unrelenting secrecy inside his isolated home office, completely arming the explosive mechanism of his ultimate financial destruction. We meticulously prepared the complex legal documentation, actively cross-referencing every single fraudulent digital transaction against the specific parameters of the poison pill clause. We prepared a massive, heavily encrypted digital packet containing the undeniable proof of Derrick's offshore wire fraud, his illegal corporate embezzlement, and the terrifying audio recording of the Shady Pines medical conspiracy. I barely slept. I barely ate. I survived entirely on black coffee and the raw adrenaline of a desperate father, fiercely fighting for his ultimate survival. Finally, the highly anticipated Thursday night arrived. Tonight, at exactly midnight, Derrick planned to drain the remaining $12 million from the corporate accounts and quietly wire the massive fortune to his untraceable Cayman Islands safe haven. Tomorrow morning, at exactly 9 o'clock, Derrick's armed medical team would aggressively arrive at my front door with a fake psychiatric warrant to violently drag me out of my stolen home and permanently lock me inside a forgotten dementia ward. I sat silently in the dim light of Rick's home office, staring intensely at the glowing screen of my heavily encrypted laptop. The digital clock in the bottom corner of the monitor read 11:55 p.m. 5 minutes, until Derek officially initiates the massive offshore wire transfer. I pressed the command key instantly, aggressively breathing life into the heavy, complicated decryption software we had meticulously compiled. The screen flashed a brilliant stark white, before smoothly transitioning into the raw, unfiltered command terminal of the primary corporate banking portal. A harsh green prompt actively blinked on the dark monitor, aggressively requesting the ultimate biometric authorization sequence. I plugged a small portable fingerprint scanner directly into the USB port of my laptop. I pressed my right thumb firmly against the glowing glass sensor. A sudden, incredibly satisfying electronic chime loudly echoed from the laptop speakers. I was fully embedded inside the central international wire system of the Crawford Commercial Financial Network. I currently possessed absolute, unilateral, unregulated control over every single liquid asset tied to the corporate entity. No board approval was required. The poison pill had officially granted me the absolute power of a corporate dictator. I swiftly navigated through the complex maze of internal corporate ledgers, diving straight into the restricted international holding directories. I heavily filtered the active transaction queues, specifically targeting the outgoing international wire transfers. A staggering $12,400,000 was sitting quietly in a temporary, heavily encrypted corporate holding account. Derek had meticulously queued the massive transfer to automatically initiate at exactly 8:00 a.m. on Friday morning. The final destination routing number was tied directly to a highly secure, entirely untraceable private banking institution located deep within the Cayman Islands. I moved my digital cursor directly over the massive pending wire transfer. I did not feel a single ounce of paternal hesitation. I simply clicked the execution prompt. A secondary warning box instantly popped up on the monitor, explicitly demanding administrative confirmation to permanently cancel the scheduled international transaction. I confidently typed in my unique alphanumeric founder identification code and violently struck the Enter key with deliberate, absolute finality. The glowing red line item instantly evaporated from the active queue. The massive fortune was immediately ripped, entirely out of Derek's greedy, desperate grasp, and securely locked back inside the protected foundational corporate vault. The getaway vehicle had just been completely dismantled. But simply stopping the theft was no longer sufficient. I navigated back to the primary directory. Derek had been incredibly sloppy in his desperate rush to steal everything. He and Monica had established a highly secure joint personal banking account to safely store their previously embezzled consulting fees and actively finance their lavish lifestyle. But to easily facilitate the continuous flow of stolen corporate funds, they had technically structured their private banking portal as a direct dependent subaccount of the primary Crawford Commercial Financial umbrella. I instantly bypassed the secondary firewalls, separating their personal finances from the business network. I aggressively linked directly into the heart of their exclusive joint account. The balance staring actively back at me was a staggering $800,000. This was the liquid reserve meant to directly fund their luxurious tropical getaway while I rotted away in a state-funded psychiatric ward. I securely consolidated the targeted funds. I digitally merged the massive $12,400,000 with the $800,000 sitting comfortably in Derek and Monica's personal checking account. Rick and I had spent the previous afternoon meticulously constructing a completely impenetrable financial fortress. We established a highly complex, bulletproof, irrevocable trust permanently located within the state of South Dakota. Once the funds confidently crossed into the strict legal boundaries of that specific trust, they would instantly become entirely, legally untouchable, permanently shielded from any future corporate bankruptcy proceedings, fully protected from aggressive federal asset forfeiture, and completely insulated from any desperate legal challenges. The newly combined total boldly populated in glowing green text directly in the center of the monitor. $13,200,000. I hovered the digital cursor precisely over the final automated authorization prompt. I firmly pressed the mouse button. The screen flashed brightly with a simple, beautifully definitive message. Transfer successful. The South Dakota Irrevocable Trust was instantly legally locked down. The vast funds were permanently legally inaccessible to Derek under any conceivable circumstances. He could never touch a single dime. I eagerly navigated through the administrative menus and pulled up the active financial dashboard for Derek and Monica's exclusive joint personal account. I hit the refresh key. The previous balance of $800,000 was gone, completely wiped from the digital ledger as if it had never existed. The glowing digital numbers actively staring back at me on the high-resolution monitor read zeros. They were completely, irrevocably ruined. I securely opened a separate digital directory containing the gathered arsenal of their absolute downfall. I actively uploaded the horrifying medical documentation, including the fraudulent Stage 2 Alzheimer's disease diagnosis and the incriminating $50,000 cash bribe receipt. I seamlessly integrated the crystal-clear audio recordings, capturing Derek, proudly boasting about securing the permanent conservatorship and planning my physical extraction to Shady Pines. I confidently attached the massive, catastrophic offshore financial ledgers, proving his illegal cryptocurrency leveraging and massive institutional wire fraud. I securely accessed a specialized email client, specifically designed to properly protect high-level federal whistleblowers. In the primary recipient field, I entered the direct contact address for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically routing the massive dossier to the White-Collar Crime Division. In the secondary recipient field, I securely entered the contact address for the Criminal Investigation Unit of the Internal Revenue Service. I forcefully clicked the execution command. I hit send. The screen instantly refreshed, clearly displaying a simple bright green confirmation message. Message delivered. The massive, inescapable federal trap had officially slammed completely shut on their necks. It was exactly 6 o'clock in the morning when I confidently pulled into the sweeping driveway of my own stolen home. Derek and Monica were undoubtedly still upstairs in the master suite, sleeping the deep sleep of the incredibly greedy. They firmly believed that in just 3 short hours, a private medical transport team would forcefully drag me out of my bedroom. I quietly unlocked the heavy oak front door and confidently stepped into the grand foyer. I walked silently up the back staircase and systematically gathered a few changes of durable clothing into a faded canvas duffel bag. I completely left behind the tailored suits, the silk ties, and the expensive gold watches. Those flashy items solidly belonged to an executive who no longer existed. I carried the heavy duffel bag downstairs and walked directly into the pristine custom kitchen. I systematically pulled out the physical copies of the damning documents and actively arranged them on the cold marble surface with deliberate geometric precision. First, I placed the fraudulent medical file directly in the center. Second, I placed the perfectly forged corporate property deed next to the medical file, specifically circling the fraudulent signature. Third, I pulled my old smartphone from my coat pocket and securely placed it squarely on top of the forged property documents. I actively queued up the exact digital timestamp of their horrific parking lot conversation. I finally reached into the utility drawer and successfully pulled out a bright red permanent marker. I grabbed a blank sheet of stationery paper from the kitchen desk and firmly pressed the tip against the pristine white paper. I meticulously wrote the words with a slow, deliberate cadence. Do not bother calling the ambulance. I confidently moved down to the next line, and definitely, do not bother checking your bank accounts. When Derek and Monica finally walked down those stairs to eagerly await my medical extraction, they would instantly realize in one blinding moment that their Cayman getaway fund was vaporized, their secret medical conspiracy was exposed, and the relentless fury of the federal government was already marching directly toward their front door. I walked out the front door and pulled it firmly shut. I climbed back into the freezing cab of my pickup truck, turned the heavy key, and aggressively pulled away from the estate without a single shred of regret. It was exactly 8:15 a.m. The heavy wheels of my vintage Ford pickup truck eagerly devoured the long stretches of black asphalt as I confidently merged onto Interstate 77. I was steadily driving south. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing electronic ringtone forcefully shattered the comfortable morning silence. The aggressive sound came from a cheap, untraceable burner phone resting lightly on the worn passenger seat. I calmly reached over and pressed the green accept button. "Dad, what did you do?" Derek violently screamed through the tiny speaker, his voice actively cracking with sheer, unadulterated panic. He was audibly hyperventilating, struggling desperately to pull oxygen into his lungs. "The money is completely gone," Derek wailed, his voice ascending into a frantic, high-pitched shriek. "I tried to initiate the Cayman transfer, but the entire corporate holding account is locked. Then I checked my personal accounts, and the bank says my balance is zero. We have absolutely nothing left. Dad, please, you have to fix this. The FBI is currently swarming the lobby of the headquarters with federal warrants." I strictly refused to forcefully let his desperate tears penetrate my fortified emotional armor. I boldly spoke with the chilling, absolute calm of a man who had successfully reclaimed his stolen soul. "You explicitly told me to stop wasting your money, Derek," I replied smoothly, letting the cold reality of my exact words pierce straight through his hysterical sobbing. "I did exactly that. I successfully secured the funds, entirely exposed your medical conspiracy, and actively handed your illegal cryptocurrency ledgers directly to the federal government. I am simply honoring your aggressive request to step aside." I paused for a single second. "Enjoy your bankruptcy, son." I aggressively pressed the end button permanently, entirely severing the connection. I forcefully grasped the cheap plastic burner phone tightly in both hands and cleanly snapped the device directly in half. I rolled down the driver's side window and aggressively tossed the shattered plastic pieces out onto the highway shoulder. The warm, early Carolina sun bathed my face, completely melting away the lingering traces of the dark nightmare I had just permanently escaped. I firmly pressed my foot heavily on the accelerator, actively driving into absolute freedom. Let my painful story be a harsh, uncompromising warning to anyone who tirelessly builds an empire exclusively for their children. Trust is a beautiful thing, but blind trust is a dangerous weapon you hand directly to your enemies. If your children aggressively see your lifelong sacrifices as an absolute entitlement rather than a privilege, quickly cut the cord before they ruthlessly cut your throat. A true legacy is built on demanding respect, securely keeping your dignity intact, and having the courage to actively walk away. If this story successfully opened your eyes, please hit that like button to actively support a father who aggressively fought back. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss these harsh truths. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what would you have aggressively done to Derek? Stay sharp and stay strong.